This video will be about the story of two presidents, two companies, one area where they all kind of join together, and perceptions and opinions and laws concerning subject matter. This will concern firearms and history and weirdnesses. The company I'm discussing first has a vague history, mostly because they're just a company that did stuff. They made things, not a conglomerate that did hundreds of different things, but they would do one or two things and then shift slowly over to another, and they were never really known for one activity, machining shop kind of stuff. The first thing they're known for, and it's the one you will see them still repeating, is they made drill chucks. So anyway, Rome, or Rom, GmbH of Sometime Brenz. It's very, this is like Germany stuff, right? European Union stuff. Hi, I'm a stupid American playing at it. Anyway, in the 1950s, vague timing, self-defense, tear gas, blank alarm guns, flare guns, and starting pistols became very popular in the European Union because of changes in gun rules, laws, and attitudes. Also, in the level of safety people felt. Flare guns are a signaling device. They use smoke and light, but not sound. Starter pistols, self-defense, tear gas guns, and blank alarm guns are also signal devices by definition. They're sometimes sold that way. They're usually sold, like we would say in the United States, with the, in this case, safety or signaling exemption to any kind of restriction on the company making them. They would have probably applied for a permit, that sort of thing, to make these. They also sold live-fire real pistols, handguns. Mostly revolvers, 22 caliber long rifle, 25 ACP, 32 Smith & Wesson, and 38 Special. Now, if you're not aware of how guns are made, I'm sure they made more than just revolvers, but the revolver is the one we're going to be talking about specifically. 1968 in the United States. Gun Control Act prohibited small, cheap handgun imports. Import was redefined, obviously, if you had a company within the United States and paid U.S. taxes and were considered an American company. So they opened up a location in Miami, Florida, and sold under the brand name Rome, I can't pronounce it, Gesellschaft. RG Industries for short, because American. And then it was changed from 1984 through 1986 when they closed to Rome Products of America. And it could be Rom or Rome. I'm obviously mispronouncing this. Lots of umults and heavy metal music in the background. So, heavy metal balls joke. So, now this company made these, obviously if they're making starting pistols, basically cap guns and real guns, a way of easing up on production spool up and consistency and improving the quality is to just go ahead and make a really, really cheap real gun and then make it do all these other things. The flare gun obviously being a slightly different version, at least. Some flare guns actually just use a blank firing gun to propel a flare. It has to have some fire from the ignition to ignite it, but that's about it. And that was rather common because then you could buy one, basically a cap gun, it wasn't as regulated, and have it fire. But that meant that the pathway had to be semi-clear. If it had a clear pathway, because you usually used a blank firing cartridge that was a real cartridge, like a 22 blank, then it would be qualified as a real gun. If you spent the extra little money on it, maybe a permit, depending on what the rules were in the area, you'd have a real gun. They could also have, obviously, it would be considered a starter pistol. They can fire bullets. A real gun that's more of a starter pistol. You get the idea. By making these kind of homogenized, they could make them less difficult to make, and they could use the same parts. And again, if you change out a cylinder or change out a barrel, a readily convertible gun like that isn't illegal, and it's advantageous as hell for design. You could even sell them as a kit. And a lot of them were, depending on the local laws, just sold as a pistol that could be converted over to something less lethal, because that's just the easiest way to do the design. But because they did this, they might use steel reinforcements inside of, let's say, a aluminum or zinc body. Very common, usually with zinc. Gun Control Act in the United States prohibiting small cheap handgun importation is partially based on that kind of design activity. It should also be pointed out that these designs were bog standard. Using really old, expired patents as a basis for making these meant that they had literally almost no ability to be sued for shit. They could just sell them. Nobody cared. And they could also just make cap guns. Real firearms makers make cap guns because it's a way of making money when they're not selling guns. And also recycling old metal. Now we shift over to Dallas, Texas. Not Miami, Florida, not Germany. Dallas, Texas. 70-year-old Isaac Goldstein ran a place called Rocky's Police Equipment Discount. Pawn shop. Many names, many signs all over many buildings. One of 1,700 federal firearms licensed dealers in the Dallas metro area, paying $10 to $50 so they could have gun and ammo licenses to sell them. They had the fees paid. Pawn shops that sell guns are very common because they have to be able to do so. Also, they have to have an ammunition license because a lot of times the supposedly unloaded gun comes in with bullets, and technically they bought the bullet when they buy the gun. It occupied several buildings at the east end of Elm Street. Its main address was 2524, and I'll have a link below in the description to where that probably really was. This is the same street that, if you follow it along, away from that building, leads to where Lee Harvey Oswald shot JFK. And you might want to realize some of the mail order gun laws were established because of JFK. October 13th, 1980. We're skipping ahead here. The Isaac Goldstein's son, David Goldstein, was working that day at the pawn shop. Sold two $47 Blue Steel Rome RG-14 .22 caliber long rifle revolvers to a 25-year-old guy, college kid. He had a valid ID, no criminal record, never been committed to a mental institution. There weren't any listings or records anywhere of him ever using any drugs or fulfilling any other requirement at the time or even currently in most states for him to be denied the right to buy the gun or having any kind of red flag against him that was listed. At the time this happened, he may or may not have been a stalker of a specific person. Probably was. Whether or not the Dallas police would know about that or be able to check on it, even with modern methodology, I don't know if he would even qualify for red flag. So after that, in October, 5 months later or whatever, March 30th, John Hinckley Jr. shot Reagan and 3 other people with that pistol. He bought 2 of them, but he used one of them to shoot them. There isn't any way I could find any way that any current methodology anybody can come up with would have kept him from getting this except a red flagging. And at the time, and even now, I don't think it would have worked. Just saying. Now, he used basically a glorified cap gun, basically a starter pistol style design that was made able to fire real ammunition by using a reinforced version of the cylinder. May have been entirely steel, and it had a barrel with rifling in it because that's a requirement. And people who have used this cheap $47 gun, right now I can do the same thing. I would have to use a starter pistol and make one, but I can use the spare parts kit for the one that it's based on. The gun has been reviewed by people. People have had a copy of these. Lots of people bought them. They were all over the place. Saturday night specials were very common. It's notorious for having not the shittiest reputation. It worked, obviously. He decided to load it with a novelty round. I'm saying that because it really was at the time considered that, and even today probably would be by anybody who would evaluate it even-handedly and cool-headedly, if that's a word. In Norcross, Georgia, Bingham Limited Company put out something called the Devastator brand Detano Expanding .22 caliber long rifle cartridge, and he loaded 6 of them in it. This is a hollow point standard .22 long rifle cartridge that you can put into these pistols because they can take long rifle bullets, cartridges. The bullet was a hollow point, and what the company did is they bought them in mass, made sure the hollow point, the hole that's drilled in for the hollow point, was consistent, and then they lacquer sealed in a little aluminum cylinder, looked like a pin, that was filled with a priming compound, the same thing that you use for firing the bullets in the first place. This was a lead azide detonator charge. This is the kind of thing you use for detonation, for a detonator. It's a primary explosive, and it has a detonation velocity of over 5,000 meters a second. It's at 17,000 feet per second. And a very tiny amount of it. In fact, it's tiny enough that it's not considered something that gets regulated as some sort of explosive bullet most of the time. And it's currently not illegal, as far as I can tell, in most areas because it has such a tiny amount of a charge. This is the equivalent, not directly, but the equivalent to just taking an air gun and firing a primer out of a pistol at a wall. These things had enough of an explosive in them that they would, on impact, if you fired them at a hard enough object, it would mash the bullet. But instead of the bullet doing what a normal bullet would do, it would actually break it up a bit. So it'd be more of a frangible round. It would throw little bits of lead and copper shrapnel everywhere if it had copper on it. And people have also reproduced this for experimentation purposes at colleges to see what this would have had an effect on during the shooting of Reagan. Because Reagan got hit with a fragment of, or the entire bullet bouncing off of the armored limousine that the president was getting into at the time. Brady, one of the people who was hit in the eye socket, and it went into, well, not the eye socket, but hit into in the skull, and it ended up getting inside of his skull, and it probably exploded from the impact, or not. There's some debate. He ultimately died from that. Long time later. One person had one stuck in his neck, and it was considered a possible explosion later that they took it out. People have done experiments reproducing these designs and found that they just don't detonate, so the surgery may have been considered unnecessary, but I don't fault them for removing it because it's an unknown. The company owner stated flat out, there's no way for these to cook off. They either detonate or they don't. And the idea with the design, if you look up people who actually bought packaging of them, was that you were supposed to shoot a varmint with them and aim for bone material like rib cage or hip or skull and let the explosion do, quote, a shallow surface wound, not intended for deep penetration. But obviously if it doesn't detonate, it'll go just as deep as a hollow point would. Actually deeper because it's plugged. It would act as a round nose bullet. The company marketed these exploding fragmentation slugs as for police use. That's one of the excuses that's used in marketing to say, you know, this is only for the police, and then they sell it to everybody else. And the police didn't use it, I don't think. I'm pretty sure they didn't. This is a novelty item most of the time. Saturday night specials. What are they defined as? Small, disposably cheap manufactured firearms. Guns that are designed to be so cheap that throwing them away wouldn't be a big deal. Remember, this is in 1980s money, and I should point out that you can buy almost an identical design because they just keep reusing old patents as a, again, starter pistol, which has every characteristic of being readily convertible to firing real rounds. Well, no. What you do is you end up having to buy a new cylinder because it's a revolver, and you end up having to do so many hacks and twists, altering the frame to get the barrel out, that you just end up making a new gun. But it's $47.50 now, and it isn't supposed to fire real bullets. Other places, other countries, you can find these still just about as cheap, or an equivalent cost in 1980s money. They are perceived as low quality and are asserted to be favored by criminals and have no other purpose except crime. Now, this is based on people not looking at the statistic where they find out that criminals are only interested in finding highly reliable weapons. They don't care what the cost is. Just reliable and durable. And if they're going to get a cheap gun they're going to throw away, they would rather use a used gun they buy because it'll be better quality than a brand new one that would be cheap. Some self-defense, tear gas, blank, alarm, and starting pistols can be converted to fire live ammunition. Don't do so because they usually break. They're made out of weak materials, weaker than these. The perception that these guns are only for aren't just for poor people trying to defend themselves bothers me. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that.